Anthony had been driving through the streets of New York City for years, listening to stories and keeping secrets. But on that night, when three young men entered his taxi, everything changed. What began as a simple ride revealed unexpected connections and a past that few knew about. Want to know what happened? Stay until the end. Night had already settled over New York City when Anthony adjusted the rearview mirror of his taxi one last time before starting another night shift. His grey hair reflected the light from the street lamps illuminating Fifth Avenue, while his eyes, still alert despite his 65 years, scanned the streets with the experience of someone who knew every corner, every shadow of the metropolis. The radio was broadcasting the latest news of the day, but Anthony barely paid attention. His mind wandered between the present and memories of a past that few knew about. 20 years had passed since he decided to trade luxurious offices and board meetings for the simplicity of a taxi steering wheel. A decision that surprised everyone who knew him, but for him it meant a form of redemption, a reconnection with the city that watched him grow. In his youth, Anthony had been known as the strategist, not for illicit activities, but for his extraordinary ability to transform companies on the brink of bankruptcy into commercial empires. His name was whispered in the corridors of the country's largest conglomerates, and his presence in a negotiation was enough to make the toughest businessmen reconsider their positions. Now, after 2 decades away from the spotlight, he found peace in conversations with unknown passengers, in the stories he heard, and occasionally in the advice he offered to lost young people whom fate placed in his path. The taxi had become his confessional on wheels, where people from all social classes shared their lives, their dreams, and their fears. On that particular night, something in the air seemed different. Perhaps it was the cold wind blowing between the skyscrapers or the unusual movement for a Tuesday. Anthony couldn't say for certain, but his instincts, sharpened by years of business experience, warned him that this would not be an ordinary night. Around 11 p.m., while waiting at the taxi stand near a famous nightclub, 3 young men approached his car. They wore designer clothes, but something in their gazes betrayed a greater uneasiness than usual in men their age. The leader of the group, a tall young man of no more than 25 years, opened the passenger door. "Good evening, sir. Can you take us to the Upper East Side?" The voice tried to sound casual, but Anthony noticed the subtle tremor in the young man's words. In 2 decades as a taxi driver, he had developed a sixth sense for identifying passengers in delicate situations. "Sure, get in," Anthony replied, keeping his voice calm and professional. The 3 young men settled into the back seat, and the taxi plunged into the New York night. The silence inside the vehicle was dense, broken only by the soft sound of the radio and the noise of traffic. Through the rearview mirror, Anthony observed his passengers. The leader of the group, sitting right behind him, maintained a tense posture, constantly checking his cell phone. The other 2 alternated glances between the windows and their leader, as if waiting for instructions. It was when they were passing along the Hudson River Parkway that the young leader finally spoke. "Actually, sir, we need to go somewhere." "Else?" His voice now carried a thinly veiled, threatening tone. Anthony merely smiled through the rearview mirror. In another time, a situation like this would have alarmed him. But now, with the wisdom of years and a past that few knew about, he saw beyond the surface. He saw 3 lost young men trying to prove something to themselves in the wrong way. "Let me guess," said Anthony, his voice taking on a tone he hadn't used in years, the tone that made CEOs and executives pay attention. "You're Albert Matthews." "Boys, aren't you?" The name had the expected effect. The group's leader visibly paled, and the other 2 looked at each other in confusion. Albert Matthews was a well-known businessman in real estate, famous for his luxury developments and for having lost everything in a recent financial scandal. "How? How do you know?" stammered the young man. "I've known your father for a long time, Michael," Anthony replied, surprising the young man even more by using his name. "And I know exactly why you're here tonight." The silence that followed was deafening. Michael, Albert Matthews' son, had planned to use the taxi driver as part of a scheme to get money and help his father out of the crisis. What he didn't expect was that fate would put him face to face with Anthony Miller, The man who 2 decades ago was known as the country's greatest expert in corporate recovery. "I think we have a lot to talk about," Anthony continued, turning the taxi toward a 24-hour cafe he knew well. "And maybe I can help you in ways you never imagined." The 3 young men in the back seat remained silent, their minds trying to process the unexpected turn of events. What had begun as a desperate attempt to solve financial problems was about to transform into something very different, something that would change their lives forever. The night was just beginning, and Anthony knew he had an important mission ahead, to show those young men that there is always a better way, a more dignified solution, no matter how desperate the situation seems. After all, he himself had traveled a similar journey, choosing to abandon power and prestige for something more meaningful, the chance to make a difference in people's lives, one taxi ride at a time. The cafe on Madison Avenue was practically empty at that hour of the night. Only a sleepy waitress and a couple of students occupied the space, illuminated by fluorescent lights. Anthony led the 3 young men to a table in the back, where they could talk without being disturbed. Michael, still visibly disturbed, sat across from the taxi driver, while his friends Lucas and Ralph occupied the side chairs. "4 coffees, please," Anthony ordered from the waitress who approached. His experienced eyes studied the young men before him. Despite their expensive clothes and rehearsed posture, they were just scared kids, products of privileged upbringings, who were now facing the bitter taste of reality. "How do you know my father?" Michael finally broke the silence, his voice a mixture of curiosity and mistrust. Anthony took his wallet from his pocket and removed an old photo yellowed by time. In the image, 2 young men smiled in front of a small office. One of them was Albert Matthews, Michael's father, and the other was Anthony himself, both at the beginning of their careers. "Your father and I started together," Anthony explained, passing the photo to Michael. "We were 2 ambitious young men with big dreams for the real estate market. That was more than 30 years ago, before the boom in the sector, before the skyscrapers and luxury condominiums." Lucas and Ralph leaned in to see the photo, their expressions of surprise evident. The waitress arrived with the coffees, and Anthony waited for her to move away before continuing. "What do you know about the history of Matthews' developments?" he asked, taking a sip of his coffee. "That my father built it from nothing," Michael replied with a touch of pride in his voice, "and that it was one of the largest in the country until the Horizon Project scandal," Anthony completed, noting how Michael shrank at the mention of the subject. "But there's much more to that story than what was published in the newspapers." Ralph, who had remained silent until then, leaned forward. "Were you partners with his father?" "Not exactly," Anthony smiled. "I was what they called the strategist. When real estate companies faced problems, I was called in to solve them. Restructuring, negotiating with creditors, strategic mergers. That was my job. And that's how I met Albert Matthews, at a crucial moment for his company." Michael frowned, recalling stories he had heard in childhood. "Wait, you're Anthony Miller? The same Anthony Miller who saved Palmetto Construction in 1995? "The same," Anthony confirmed. "But that was in another life. Today I'm just a taxi driver who knows the city streets well, and occasionally finds young people in need of guidance." Lucas, who had been observing everything in silence, spoke up. "If you were so successful, why did you become a taxi driver?" The question hung in the air for a few moments. Anthony observed the movement of the street through the cafe window, as if seeking the right words in the lights of passing cars. "Sometimes we need to lose everything to find what really matters," he finally answered. "I had money, power, influence, but I also had ulcers, insomnia, and no true friends. It took some significant events to make me realize I was on the wrong path." "What events?" asked Michael, increasingly intrigued by the story of this man, who seemed to know so many secrets about his family. "That's a story for another time," Anthony deflected. "Now I need to understand exactly what kind of trouble you've gotten yourselves into, and why you thought using an elderly taxi driver as part of a plan would be a good idea." The 3 young men looked at each other, embarrassed. It was Michael who took the initiative to explain. "After the scandal, my father lost everything. The company, his reputation, our savings. He's devastated, barely leaves the house. The investors who lost money sued him, and now they want to take our house. We thought that if we could get some money, we could at least save the house." Anthony listened attentively, his face a mask of understanding. "And do you think your father would be happy to know that his son is trying to solve problems this way?" "He doesn't know," Michael admitted, lowering his eyes. "Actually, he barely talks to me since it all happened. I think he feels ashamed, guilty." "Albert was always too proud," Anthony commented, more to himself than to the others. "But you need to understand something. What happened with the Horizon project wasn't exactly how the press reported it." This statement immediately caught the attention of the three young men. Michael, especially, seemed to awaken from a trance. "What do you mean? What do you know about it?" "I know enough to say that your father isn't the villain they painted him to be," Anthony replied, leaning forward. "And if you're willing to trust me, I can help you discover the truth and perhaps find a legal way out of this situation." "Why would you help us?" Lucas questioned, still suspicious. "Because 20 years ago, when I decided to change my life, I made a promise to myself to use my experience to help people who were lost just as I once was. And you, my young friends, are more lost than you realize." Anthony took a business card from his pocket, not his taxi card, but an old one, with gold-rimmed edges already faded. On the back, he wrote an address and a time. "Tomorrow at 10 a.m. at this address. If you really want to help your father, show up. I'll show you how to solve problems the right way." Michael took the card with trembling hands, studying the address written in Anthony's elegant handwriting. It was a crucial decision, to trust a stranger who had appeared out of nowhere, but who seemed to know all the secrets of his family, or to proceed with his original desperate plan. "And if we don't go?" asked Ralph, verbalizing the doubt that lingered in everyone's mind. "Then I'll continue my life as a taxi driver, and you'll continue yours," Anthony replied, standing up and leaving some bills on the table to pay for the coffees. "But know that some opportunities appear only once in a lifetime, and this might be the chance you've been waiting for to make a difference." With these words, Anthony walked to the exit of the cafe, leaving the three young men immersed in thoughts. Before leaving, he turned one last time. "Oh, and Michael, tell your father that the Phoenix project is still standing. He'll understand." The mention of this unknown name left Michael even more intrigued. As he watched the taxi driver disappear into the New York night, he knew that an important decision would need to be made. What had begun as a desperate plan had transformed into something much bigger, something that could change not only his destiny, but that of his entire family. The next morning, the address provided by Anthony turned out to be an old mansion in Paradise Heights, an imposing building that seemed to bravely resist time and the modernization of the city. Michael, Lucas, and Ralph arrived punctually at 10 o'clock, still debating whether they had made the right decision. The wrought iron gate creaked softly when they pushed it. The garden, although well-maintained, had an air of antiquity that matched the atmosphere of the place. Before they reached the main door, it opened, revealing Anthony, now wearing a well-tailored suit that made him look very different from the taxi driver of the night before. "Welcome to the former headquarters of the Phoenix project," he announced, gesturing for them to enter. The interior of the mansion was surprising. Antique furniture mingled with modern equipment, and the walls were covered with framed photographs and newspaper clippings. "What exactly is this place?" asked Michael, his eyes scanning the images on the walls. In many of them he recognized his father when younger, always alongside Anthony and other businessmen he knew only by name. "This," Anthony replied, leading them to a spacious meeting. Certain matter was where some of the country's greatest corporate recoveries were planned. The Phoenix project wasn't just a project, it was a philosophy, a different way of doing business. The meeting room was dominated by a massive oval wooden table, and on the walls, more photographs and framed documents told a story of success after success. Anthony indicated the chairs for them to sit. 20 years ago, he continued, your father and I, along with other businessmen, created something unique, a group dedicated not just to saving companies from bankruptcy, but to transforming them. into something better, more ethical and sustainable. But why has no one ever heard of this? Questioned Lucas, adjusting himself in the leather chair. Because true power lies in discretion, replied Anthony, activating a remote control that lowered a projection screen. The less people know about how you operate, the more effective you can be in making real changes. Images began to appear on the screen, graphs, spreadsheets, and photographs documenting 2 decades of secret operations in the business world. They weren't illegal operations, but rather meticulous work of restructuring and transforming companies in crisis. The Horizon Project, Anthony continued, arriving at the point that most interested Michael, should have been your father's greatest success. A revolutionary development that would combine affordable housing with environmental sustainability, but someone didn't want it to succeed. Michael leaned forward, his heart accelerating. Who? Victor Montgomery, answered Anthony, projecting a photo of a middle-aged man with a severe expression. One of the largest developers in the country and your father's main competitor. He knew that if the Horizon Project was successful, it would revolutionize the real estate market and threaten his traditional business model. Ralph, who had been observing everything in silence until then, spoke up. Are you saying that my uncle, that Victor sabotaged the project? The revelation fell like a bomb in the room. Michael and Lucas looked at their friend in surprise. Few knew that Ralph was Victor Montgomery's nephew, and this fact added a new layer of complexity to the situation. Your uncle, Anthony said softly, is a man who believes that the ends justify the means. He orchestrated a smear campaign against the project, bribed inspectors to find non-existent irregularities, and finally manipulated documents to make it appear that your father, Michael, had diverted resources from investors. But why did my father never defend himself? Why didn't he report this? Michael asked, his voice trembling with emotion. Anthony sighed deeply before answering. Because Victor threatened to expose something that your father wanted to protect at all costs. You, Michael. The silence that followed was deafening. Michael felt as if the air had been sucked from the room. Me? What do I have to do with this? Your father discovered that Victor had fabricated evidence linking you to some suspicious transactions in the company. You were only an intern at the time, but he managed to forge documents that would make it appear that you were involved in an embezzlement scheme. Albert preferred to take all the blame rather than see his son's life destroyed before it even began. Tears began to roll down Michael's face. All those months blaming his father, thinking he had betrayed everyone's trust, when in fact he had sacrificed everything to protect him. And that's where the Phoenix Project comes in, Anthony continued, his voice taking on a more determined tone. We never really ceased to exist. We just stayed in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to act. And that moment has come. He walked to an old safe hidden behind one of the paintings, and from it retrieved a thick folder. Here is all the documentation that proves your father's innocence and Victor Montgomery's guilt. Bank records, emails, recordings of meetings, everything meticulously collected over the past 2 years. Why didn't you use this before? Asked Lucas. Because we needed something more, someone willing to testify, Anthony replied, looking significantly at Ralph. Someone from Victor's inner circle who could confirm his actions. Ralph turned pale, understanding the weight of the responsibility being placed on his shoulders. You want me to testify against my own uncle? I want you to do what's right, Anthony gently corrected. Victor didn't just destroy the Horizon Project and Albert's life. He ruined dozens of families who invested their savings in the project, people who believed in the dream of owning their own home. The young man lowered, his eyes clearly conflicted. Michael placed a hand on his shoulder in solidarity. He knew it wasn't an easy decision. But that's not all, Anthony continued, returning to the table and spreading more documents. The Phoenix Project always had a greater goal, to create a new generation of business leaders, people committed to a more ethical and sustainable way of doing business. And you three, without knowing it, have become part of that plan. How so? Asked Michael. Last night, when you entered my taxi, you were about to make a mistake that could ruin your lives, but you also demonstrated courage, loyalty, and most importantly, the ability to recognize when you're on the wrong path. You're exactly the kind of people the Phoenix Project looks for. Anthony pressed another button on the remote control, and a new image appeared on the screen. The plans for a modern housing complex, with green areas and solar panels. This is Horizon Project 2.0, he announced with a smile, an updated and even more ambitious version of the original project. And we want you three to be part of it, not just as participants, but as leaders. The three young men looked at each other, a mixture of surprise and excitement on their faces. What had begun as a night of misguided decisions was transforming into an opportunity for redemption, not just for them, but for everyone involved. The afternoon sun was already filtering through the mansion's windows when the three young men finally absorbed the weight of Anthony's revelations. Ralph walked restlessly around the room, his hands in his pockets, betraying his nervousness. The discovery that his own uncle was responsible for the ruin of his best friend's family was consuming him from within. "I need some time," murmured Ralph, heading to the mansion's veranda. Michael made a motion to follow him, but Anthony stopped him with a gentle gesture. "Some decisions need to be made in solitude," said the experienced mentor, his eyes reflecting the understanding of someone who had faced similar dilemmas. "Let him process all this." Lucas, who had remained relatively quiet during the revelations, finally spoke up. "What happens now? I mean, we have all this evidence, but how do we use it without destroying Ralph's life, too?" Anthony smiled, satisfied, with the insightful question. He walked to an old mahogany desk in the corner of the room, and from it retrieved more documents. The Phoenix Project was never about destruction, even when dealing with people who caused harm to others, he explained, spreading the papers on the table. "Our approach has always been more strategic." The documents revealed a meticulously elaborated plan, a complete restructuring of Victor Montgomery's business group, transforming it into something more ethical and transparent, without necessarily publicly exposing his past mistakes. "You see," Anthony continued, "Victor built his empire through questionable practices, but he also employs thousands of people. A public exposure wouldn't just harm him, but entire families who depend on these companies." Michael frowned, a hint of indignation in his voice. "So he's simply going to get away with everything he did to my father?" "Not get away," Anthony corrected, a shrewd gleam in his eyes. "But there's a difference between justice and vengeance. What I propose is a way to correct the mistakes of the past while building something better for the future." At that moment, Ralph returned from the veranda, his face marked by the determination of someone who had just made a difficult decision. "My uncle has always treated me like a spoiled kid, incapable of understanding real business," he said, his voice carrying a mixture of hurt and resolution. "Maybe it's time to show him how much I've grown." Anthony nodded, satisfied. "That's exactly what we need. Someone who knows Victor from the inside and who has the courage to confront him at his own game." "But how?" asked Lucas, still trying to visualize the complete plan. "Through Horizon Project 2.0, Anthony replied, returning to the plans of the housing complex. "But this time we'll do it differently. Instead of confronting Victor directly, we'll offer him something he can't refuse, the chance to be part of something revolutionary." Michael let out an incredulous laugh. "You really think he'll accept working with my father after everything he did?" "Your father won't be the face of the project," Anthony explained, an enigmatic smile forming on his lips. "You will be." The silence that followed was loaded with possibilities. Anthony continued, "Think about it, Michael. Victor destroyed the original project because he feared competition from Albert. But a new generation of entrepreneurs, including his own nephew, proposing a revolution in the real estate market, that's something he can't ignore, especially when he realizes the profit potential involved." "And the evidence we have against him?" questioned Ralph. "It will be our guarantee," Anthony replied. "Not a threat, but a silent reminder that the path of cooperation is more beneficial than that of confrontation." Lucas, always the most pragmatic of the group, leaned over the documents of the new project. "This will require a massive investment. Where will the money come from?" "Ah," smiled Anthony, "that's the most interesting part of the plan." He pressed a button on his phone, And minutes later, the door to the room opened, revealing a figure that made Michael freeze in his place. Albert Matthews, his father, entered the room. He was thinner and had more white hair than Michael remembered, but his eyes shone with an intensity he hadn't shown in a long time. "Dad?" Michael could barely whisper, his legs trembling as he stood up. "Son," Albert replied, his voice breaking. The two embraced, years of misunderstandings and distance dissolving in that moment. When they finally separated, Albert looked at Ralph, who seemed to want to disappear into his chair. "Your uncle would be a fool not to recognize the man of integrity you've become, Ralph." Anthony observed the scene with satisfaction. Albert didn't just lose his company, he explained to the young men. He spent the last 2 years working behind the scenes, building alliances, preparing the ground for this moment. The Phoenix Project was never just about saving companies, Albert added. It was about creating a new way of doing business, one that puts people before profit. And now it's time to pass that legacy on. Michael looked at his father, then at Anthony, and finally at his friends. "So that's it? We're really going to make this happen? Rebuild everything from scratch?" "Not from scratch," Anthony corrected. "We're going to build on the foundations that already exist. Your father's experience, Ralph's courage, Lucas's pragmatism, and your own determination, Michael. Horizon Project 2.0 will be more than a real estate development. It will be a symbol that it's possible to do business differently." Ralph took a deep breath, straightening his shoulders. "I'll talk to my uncle," he announced. Not as a nephew asking for permission, but as an equal proposing a partnership. "And I'll reorganize the entire financial structure," added Lucas, already making notes on his tablet. "We can create a funding model that makes the project attractive to ethical investors." Michael looked at his father, years of repressed admiration overflowing in his eyes. "And I want to learn everything about the original project, about your dreams, about how we can do better this time." Albert smiled, proud, before turning to Anthony. "You were right, old friend. They're ready." "More than ready," Anthony confirmed. "They are exactly what the Phoenix Project has always sought. People capable of transforming adversity into opportunity, of choosing the difficult path of integrity, even when it would be easier to give in to the temptation of vengeance." The sun was beginning to set, painting the room with golden tones that seemed to symbolize the beginning of a new era. What had begun as a night of misguided decisions had transformed into something much greater, a chance for redemption, reconciliation, and revolution in the business world. Victor Montgomery's office occupied the top floor of one of the most imposing skyscrapers on Wall Street. The panoramic view of New York City served as a constant reminder of the power he had built over the decades. On that specific morning, Victor was observing the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows, awaiting a meeting his secretary had classified as urgent and confidential. When the door opened, the surprise on his face was genuine upon seeing Ralph entering, accompanied by Michael and Lucas. His nephew wore a well-cut suit and carried an executive briefcase, a very different image from the young man he was accustomed to seeing at family lunches. "Ralph, what is the meaning of this?" asked Victor, his voice oscillating between authority and curiosity. "Uncle," Ralph replied with studied calm, "we need to talk about the future of the real estate market in New York City and about some decisions from the past." Victor narrowed his eyes, studying the 3 young men before him. His gaze stopped on Michael, and a flash of recognition and perhaps concern crossed his face. "You're Albert Matthews' son," he stated, his voice taking on a colder tone. "Yes," Michael replied without hesitation, "but we're not here to discuss the past, Uncle Victor, at least not just that." The use of the term uncle by Michael did not go unnoticed. Victor sat in his leather chair, gesturing for the young men to occupy the chairs in front of him. "Very well," he said, interlacing his fingers on the glass table. "You have my attention." Ralph opened his briefcase, and from it removed an impeccably prepared presentation. With one command, the curtains in the room automatically closed, and a projector descended from the ceiling. What do you see when you look at New York City, Uncle? Ralph began, showing aerial images of the city. I see a metropolis suffocating under the weight of decades of irresponsible real estate development, but I also see a unique opportunity. The images changed, revealing the project for the housing complex they had discussed with Anthony. Victor leaned forward, his professional interest clearly aroused. Horizon Project 2.0, announced Lucas, taking over the presentation. A self-sustainable housing complex that will revolutionize the American real estate market. Horizon? Victor interrupted, his voice sharp. Are you joking with me? No, Uncle, Ralph replied firmly. We're offering you the chance to be part of the biggest revolution in the real estate market in decades, a chance to transform your legacy. Michael then took the floor, his voice calm but determined. We know what happened with the original project, Mr. Montgomery. We know everything. Victor abruptly stood up, his chair sliding backward. If this is some kind of threat… No, Ralph interrupted. It's an opportunity, a chance to correct mistakes from the past and build something truly meaningful. Lucas then projected the numbers, financial projections, feasibility studies, market analyses. The return on investment is conservatively estimated at 300% in 5 years. But more important than that, it will be the first project of this kind in North America. Victor walked to the window, his mind clearly processing all the implications. When he turned around, there was something different in his gaze. Why would you come to me after everything? Because you're the best at what you do, Ralph replied, surprising everyone with his frankness. Your methods may have been questionable, but your knowledge of the market is unmatched. And because… He hesitated for a moment. Because you're my family, and I believe that inside you there's still the man who taught me about big dreams when I was a child. The silence that followed was dense. Victor sat down again, his eyes studying each of the young men before him. And Albert, what's his role in all this? My father is not directly involved, Michael replied. This is our project, our generation, our vision. Victor let out a short laugh. And you really think you have the experience to manage something of this size? No, Lucas replied, surprising Victor with his honesty. But we have something better, the perfect combination of your experience and our vision for the future, not to mention the silent support of some of the most influential people in the market. Ralph then placed a sealed envelope on the table. Inside here is everything you need to know about our other partners, and also, he made a significant pause, all the documentation about the original project. Victor looked at the envelope as if it were a snake about to strike. Blackmail doesn't suit you, Ralph. It's not blackmail, Uncle, it's transparency. Something I learned is fundamental in modern business. Michael leaned forward. Mr. Montgomery, the market is changing. Consumers are more aware, investors more demanding. This project isn't just a business opportunity, it's a chance to reinvent yourself. And if I refuse, then we'll move forward without you, Ralph replied simply. But you'll lose the chance to be part of something truly revolutionary and to have your name associated with the future, not the past. Victor stood up again, walking to a painting on the wall. It was an old photo of him much younger, next to Ralph's father. He spent a few moments contemplating the image before turning to the young men. You have 48 hours, he finally said. I want a complete risk analysis, a detailed corporate governance plan, and a formal proposal for equity participation. Ralph smiled, removing another set of documents from his briefcase. We already have all that ready, including a confidentiality and non-competition agreement. Victor took the documents, an involuntary flash of pride crossing his face. You've really grown up, haven't you? I had good teachers, Ralph replied. Some taught me what to do, others what not to do. The three young men stood up, preparing to leave. At the door, Victor called out to Ralph, that envelope had the documentation about the original project. It's your decision, Uncle, Ralph replied. You can open it and deal with the consequences, or you can look to the future and be part of something bigger. When the door closed behind them, Victor Montgomery returned to his window, observing the city he had helped build. In his hands, The envelope weighed like all the questionable decisions he had made over the years. The choice was now his, to continue on the path he knew or to risk a new direction led by a generation he had underestimated. The sun was already setting when the group gathered again at the Phoenix Project Mansion. Anthony awaited them in the library, where Albert was nervously walking between the bookshelves. The atmosphere was charged with expectation as Ralph, Michael, and Lucas reported the events of the meeting with Victor Montgomery. "He didn't open the envelope in front of us," Ralph explained, loosening his tie. "But the way he reacted, there's something different about him, something I haven't seen in years." Anthony served coffee for everyone, an enigmatic smile on his face. Sometimes people need to see themselves through the eyes of those who love them to recognize what they've become. "I still don't trust him," declared Michael, his voice carrying the weight of years of resentment. Albert placed a comforting hand on his son's shoulder. "We don't need to trust," Lucas intervened, his usual pragmatism manifesting. "We just need to ensure that his interests are aligned with ours." He opened his laptop, projecting a series of graphs on the wall. "I've already started working on the numbers. If we get Victor's support, other investors will naturally follow." "And that's where things get interesting," said Anthony, standing up to turn on the library lights as night fell. "Do you know why I chose to be a taxi driver after years as a business consultant?" The young men looked at each other, curious. It was a question that had been hanging in the air from the beginning. "In a taxi," he continued, "you get to know the real city. Not the city of skyscrapers and luxury restaurants, but the real city. The city of people who need decent housing, of communities that dream of a chance to grow." He walked to a map of New York City fixed on one of the walls, pointing to different regions. "Over the last 20 years, I've catalogued every significant conversation, every story I heard. I've created a network of contacts, ranging from community leaders to local small business owners. And it's this network that will make the difference in Horizon Project 2.0. Lucas frowned, intrigued. "What do you mean?" "The problem with the original project," Albert explained, joining Anthony by the map, "wasn't just Victor's sabotage. It was the lack of connection with local communities. We built for people, but not with people." "Exactly," Anthony agreed. "And that's where you three come in. Michael, with your social vision inherited from your father. Ralph, with your knowledge of the traditional market through your uncle. And Lucas, with your ability to transform ideals into viable numbers." He then revealed a series of folders, each containing detailed profiles of people and organizations. "These are the true foundations of Horizon Project 2.0. Community leaders, construction cooperatives, neighborhood associations, people I've met over the years who can transform this project into something truly revolutionary. A partnership between the traditional market and local communities," murmured Ralph, beginning to understand the dimension of the plan. "More than that," added Michael, his eyes shining with renewed enthusiasm, "a completely new form of urban development, where profit and social impact are not mutually exclusive." Lucas was already typing furiously on his laptop. "We can create a shared governance model. Local communities would have equity participation through cooperatives, ensuring that development directly benefits those who need it most. And that's why we need Victor," Anthony concluded. "Not just for his money or influence, but because he represents the old model we need to transform. If we can convince him to change, others will follow." The group spent the following hours poring over maps, spreadsheets, and profiles, developing a strategy that would unite traditional market knowledge with the real needs of the city. The night was advancing, but no one showed fatigue. They were all energized by the possibility of creating something truly transformative. It was then that Ralph's phone rang. His uncle's name was flashing on the screen. Silence took over the library as Ralph answered the call, putting it on speakerphone. "I just read all the documentation." Victor's voice sounded clear in the room, "including the envelope." Ralph exchanged tense looks with the others before responding, "And what's your decision, Uncle?" There was a long pause before Victor continued. "You'll be in my office tomorrow at 8 a.m. Bring Anthony and Albert. It's time to settle accounts from the past and discuss the future." The call ended, leaving the group in a silence loaded with possibilities. Albert was the first to speak. After so long, finally. Anthony smiled, serving another round of coffee. The real work begins. Now, Victor is not the type who surrenders easily. He'll try to take control, dictate the rules. Let him think he can, Ralph interrupted, a determined gleam in his eyes. Because while he's focused on corporate power games, we'll be building something much bigger. Michael looked at the photo of his young father, alongside Victor, that was hanging on one of the walls. How can we be sure he won't try to manipulate us again? We can't, Anthony replied. But that's where the beauty of the Phoenix Project comes in. We don't depend on just one person or group. The real strength is in the network we've built, in the communities we represent. Lucas closed his laptop, a confident smile on his face. And in the numbers. The numbers don't lie. The model we've developed is proof against individual manipulations. Tomorrow, said Albert, his voice carrying a mixture of apprehension and hope, we'll know if Victor Montgomery is really ready to be part of the future, or if he'll remain stuck in the past he built himself. The group began to prepare for the next day's meeting, each aware of the crucial role they would play. The transformation they had initiated went far beyond a real estate project. It was a revolution in the way of thinking about urban development, uniting the power of the traditional market with the real needs of the city. As they organized the documents and finalized the presentations, Anthony observed the young men with pride. In their hands was not just the future of a project, but the possibility of creating a new business model, one that proved that financial success and positive social impact could and should go hand in hand. Victor Montgomery's office seemed different that morning. The curtains were completely open, allowing sunlight to flood the environment, and the traditional background music had been replaced by an expectant silence. When the group arrived promptly at 8 a.m., they found not only Victor but also a series of familiar faces from the real estate market. "Welcome," said Victor, rising from his chair. His countenance was different from the day before. There was something in his eyes that suggested a night of poor sleep and difficult decisions made. "Please, all of you, be seated." Anthony was the first to notice the details, the meticulously organized folders on the table, the presentations, already prepared on the screen, the exact number of chairs. Victor had planned every aspect of this meeting. "Before we begin," said Victor, his voice taking on a tone that no one in the room had heard before, "there's something I need to do." He walked over to Albert Matthews, who stood erect, prepared for anything. "I'm sorry, Albert, for everything." The silence that followed was deafening. Albert, after a moment of shock, extended his hand to his old rival. 20 years is a long time to carry regrets, Victor." "Yes," agreed Victor, shaking the offered hand, "and that's why we're all here today." He turned to the assembled group. "I spent the entire night reviewing not just the documentation you brought me, but my entire trajectory in the real estate market." He pressed a button, and a series of old images appeared on the screen. Projects, inaugurations, newspaper headlines. "I built an empire, it's true. But at what cost? How many lives were affected by my decisions? How many dreams were destroyed by my ambition?" Ralph observed his uncle with a mixture of surprise and caution. It was the first time he had seen him demonstrate vulnerability in public. "The original Horizon project," Victor continued, "wasn't just a threat to my business. It was a mirror that showed everything I had refused to see, a reminder that there was a better way to do things." Lucas, always attentive to details, noticed that the folders on the table contained much more than just documents from the current project. There were social impact studies, sustainable development analyses, long-term projections that went far beyond the financial aspect. "That's why," Victor proceeded, "I've decided not just to support Horizon Project 2.0, but to transform it into the center of a much bigger change." He made a gesture, and his assistants began to distribute documents to everyone present. "I'm proposing a complete restructuring of New York City's real estate market." Michael leafed through the documents with growing admiration. The plan was even more ambitious than theirs, a merger of multiple developers under a new urban development philosophy, with strong community participation and legally binding social commitments. But Victor made a significant pause. There's one condition. I want you three, Ralph, Michael, and Lucas, to lead this transformation, not as employees or subordinates, but as true agents of change. Anthony smiled discreetly. This was exactly what he had predicted when he put the three young men in Victor's path. Sometimes the best way to change a system is not to destroy it, but to transform it from within. And there's more, added Victor, his voice now carrying an emotion rarely demonstrated. He turned to Ralph. Nephew, I spent years trying to mold you in my image, when I should have realized that you were already a much better person than I ever was. Ralph felt his eyes water, years of seeking approval, finally finding resolution. That's why, Victor continued, I want you to assume the presidency of the new group. Michael will be the director of sustainable development, and Lucas the financial director. Albert, he turned to his old rival, I would like you to chair the advisory board, along with Anthony. Albert frowned. And you, Victor, what will your role be? It's time for me to retire, he replied, a serene smile on his face. But first I want to use my influence and resources to ensure that this transformation is irreversible. I've already spoken with the main shareholders and partners. They're all on board. Anthony stood up, his silent presence commanding everyone's attention. Victor, when I started the Phoenix Project so many years ago, the dream was exactly this: to create a new generation of business leaders who understood that profit and purpose can and should go hand in hand. And that's precisely why I chose to be a taxi driver, Anthony continued, surprising everyone with the revelation. Because I needed to understand the real city, the real people, their needs and dreams. I needed to find the right leaders for this transformation. Michael looked at his father, then at Victor, and finally at his friends. So all this time, since that night in the taxi, it was a test, Anthony confirmed, a test to see if you had not just the capacity, but the heart to lead this change. Victor extended his hand, offering a pen to Ralph. So, nephew, are you ready to make history? Ralph took the pen, but before signing, he looked at his friends. Michael and Lucas nodded, a silent pact being formed between them. This wasn't just a business agreement, it was a commitment to a better future. With one condition, said Ralph, his voice firm, everything we do from now on will be with complete transparency. Each decision, each project will be discussed not just with shareholders, but with the affected communities. Victor smiled, proud. I wouldn't expect anything different from you. And so in that room with a view of New York City, a new era began. An era where the power of the traditional market united with the knowledge of local communities, where development meant progress for all, not just for some. As the contracts were being signed and plans began to be drawn, Anthony observed through the window the city he loved so much, 20 years as a taxi driver, listening to stories, connecting people, preparing the ground for this moment. The Phoenix Project was finally complete, rising from the ashes of the past to create a more just and sustainable future. 3 months had passed since the historic meeting in Victor Montgomery's office. The old Phoenix Project mansion had been transformed into the temporary headquarters of the new conglomerate, its rooms now filled with plans, models, and teams working intensely. On a particularly busy morning, Ralph found himself meeting with Michael and Lucas in the library, analyzing the first results of their ambitious plan. The communities in Riverside Heights are concerned, Michael explained, spreading reports across the mahogany table. They fear that even with our proposal for equity participation, they'll end up being forced to move due to the appreciation of the area. Lucas adjusted his glasses, studying the spreadsheets on his tablet. And it's not an unfounded concern. Our projections show a 200% appreciation in the next 5 years, even with the protection mechanisms we've implemented. Ralph ran his hand through his hair, a gesture he had inherited from his uncle Victor. That's exactly why we need to accelerate. Phase 2 of the project. We can't allow real estate speculation to distort our purpose. The library door opened, and Anthony entered, still wearing his taxi driver uniform. Even after the restructuring of the group, he insisted on maintaining his night rides, arguing that it was the best way to keep the pulse of the city. "I brought something you need to see," he said, placing a newspaper of the day on the table. The headline made the three young men frown. "New real estate project faces resistance from traditional speculators." "It was predictable," commented Lucas, picking up the newspaper. "We're messing with very powerful interests. Some of the biggest players in the market aren't happy with our proposal for self-regulation of the sector." "But there's more," Anthony continued, sitting down with them. "In my rides this week, I've been hearing rumors. It seems some investors are preparing a hostile offer to take control of the group." Michael stood up abruptly. "But how?" "Victor, guarantee that all the main shareholders were aligned with our vision." "And they were," Ralph replied, his mind already working on the implications. "But 3 months is enough time for people to change their minds, especially when there's a lot of money involved." It was then that the door opened again, this time revealing Albert Matthews. His face showed concern. "I just left a meeting with the advisory board. You need to see this." He projected on the wall a series of emails and documents. The content was alarming. A group of international investors, led by an old rival of Victor's, was silently buying shares from small shareholders, accumulating a significant position in the group. "They're using shell companies," Albert explained. "That's why we didn't detect the movement before, but the objective is clear. They want to dilute our participation and take control of the project." Lucas was already typing furiously on his laptop. "This explains the strange fluctuations I noticed in the market last week. They're using trading algorithms to mask the purchases." "What can we do?" asked Michael, the concern evident in his voice. Ralph remained silent for a few moments, his gaze fixed on the old photographs that decorated the library walls. One in particular caught his attention, the image of his uncle Victor and Albert, Matthews young and smiling at the beginning of their careers. "Maybe," he finally said, "we're facing the problem the wrong way." He stood up, walking to the map of New York City on the wall. "We're trying to protect the project using the same tools of the system we want to transform." "What do you suggest?" asked Anthony, a gleam of interest in his eyes. "A silent revolution," Ralph replied. "Instead of fighting against the hostile offer in the courts or in the financial market, let's accelerate our integration with local communities. Let's transform each resident into a defender of the project." Michael began to understand the strategy. The housing cooperatives. If we can implement the shared ownership model before they gain control. "Exactly," Lucas completed, already making calculations. "Once the communities have legal participation in the project, any attempt to change control would need their approval. And even better, it would be a move totally aligned with our original principles." Anthony smiled, proud. "And I know exactly the right people to help us. 20 years as a taxi driver weren't in vain. I have contacts in all the communities we intend to serve. But we need to act quickly," Albert warned. "By my calculations, we have at most 2 weeks before they accumulate enough shares to call an extraordinary meeting." Ralph picked up his phone. "I'll call Uncle Victor. He may be officially retired, but his influence can still be useful to buy us time. And I," said Lucas, "will restructure our financial model. If we're going to empower communities, we need to ensure that the project remains economically viable." Michael was already separating the reports from the community meetings. "I'll schedule emergency assemblies in all the neighborhoods involved. People need to understand that this is their chance to become true protagonists in the transformation of their neighborhoods." The group worked intensely in the following hours, developing a detailed plan of action. What their opponents saw as an opportunity for profit, they saw as the chance to accelerate even further the revolution they had initiated. As night fell over New York City, Anthony observed the young men working with dedication. In his more than 20 years as a taxi driver, he had witnessed countless stories of ambition and greed. But there, in that library, he was seeing something different. A new generation willing to use market power not to oppress, but to empower. "You." "No," he said, making everyone look in his direction. "When I started the Phoenix Project, many called me an idealist. They said it was impossible to transform the real estate market, that the power of money would always win. But looking at you now, I see that true power isn't in money, but in the ability to unite people around a greater purpose." Ralph smiled, finally understanding the true dimension of what they were building. It wasn't just a real estate project, or even a market transformation. It was a new way of thinking about urban development, where success wasn't measured just in profits, but in the positive impact on people's lives. The week that followed was one of the most intense in the project's history. The Phoenix Project. Mansion had transformed into a veritable headquarters, with teams working 24 hours a day. On the morning of the big day, Ralph observed through the library window the first rays of sunlight touching New York City's buildings, reflecting on how they had gotten there. In just 10 days, they had accomplished what would normally take months. Michael coordinated more than 50 community assemblies, presenting the shared ownership plan to thousands of residents. Lucas developed a revolutionary financial model that guaranteed the effective participation of communities without compromising the economic viability of the project. "The first results are coming in," announced Lucas, entering the library with his inseparable laptop. 92% approval in the community assemblies. People understood that this is their chance to become protagonists of their own stories. Michael, who was bent over a table full of documents, raised his eyes with a tired but satisfied smile. "And the cooperative registrations? Did we manage to process all of them in time?" "Thanks to Anthony's network of contacts," Ralph replied. "It's amazing how a taxi driver can know so many important people in the right places." As if invoked by the mention of his name, Anthony entered the library still wearing his taxi driver uniform. "And they're not just contacts," he said, placing a pile of community newspapers on the table. "They're people who believe in the same vision as we do." The headlines of the small neighborhood newspapers told a different story from that of the major media outlets. While traditional media focused on the attempted hostile takeover, community newspapers celebrated the transformation that was underway. "But we still have a problem," warned Lucas, projecting some graphs on the wall. "The investor group has managed to accumulate 28% of the shares. In 3 days, they'll have enough to call an extraordinary meeting." It was then that Albert Matthews entered the room, accompanied by a figure no one expected to see, Victor Montgomery. "Perhaps," said Victor, his voice carrying the weight of experience, "that's exactly what we need." Ralph looked at his uncle with curiosity. Since retiring, Victor rarely appeared at the office. "What do you mean?" "Let them call the meeting," Victor replied, a shrewd smile on his face. "In fact, let's do better. Let's call it ourselves. Now." Albert nodded, understanding the plan. "A public assembly, broadcast, live to the entire city." "Exactly," Victor continued. "But it won't just be a shareholders' meeting. It will be an encounter between the old and new ways of doing business." The following hours were of intense preparation. The main auditorium of the World Trade Center was reserved for that same afternoon. The press was summoned, not just the major outlets, but also the small community newspapers that Anthony had cultivated over the years. When the doors of the auditorium opened at 2 p.m., the contrast was evident. On one side, executives in expensive suits representing the group of international investors. On the other, a diverse mixture of traditional shareholders, community leaders, and residents of the neighborhoods involved in the project. Ralph took the stage, accompanied by Michael and Lucas. The silence that settled was loaded with expectation. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his firm voice echoing through the auditorium, "we were informed that a group of investors intends to take control of this project. They believe they can buy not just shares, but the destiny of thousands of families." He paused, his eyes scanning the audience. "But what they didn't understand is that this project no longer belongs just to shareholders. It belongs to the city." With a gesture, Michael advanced the slides, showing the results of the community assemblies. Lucas then took the floor, presenting the new governance model they had developed. "In the last 2 weeks," Lucas explained, "we transformed each involved community into a legally constituted housing cooperative. Each cooperative now holds equity in the project, with voting rights in all strategic decisions." A murmur spread through the auditorium. The representative of the investor group, a middle-aged American executive, stood up. "This is irregular. You can't dilute the voting power of shareholders like that." It was then that Anthony stood up from the audience. still in his taxi driver uniform. Actually, they can. And do you know why? He walked to the stage, his presence simple but imposing. Because 20 years ago, when we created the Phoenix Project, we included a clause in the original statute that allows direct participation of communities affected by our projects. Victor then joined them on stage, a clause that I myself signed 3 months ago when I transferred control to this new generation. The American executive frantically leafed through his documents, looking for some legal loophole, but there was none. The Phoenix Project, since its conception, had been designed for this moment. But the most important thing, Ralph continued, isn't the legal aspects. It's what we're building here. He gestured to the diverse audience. Look around. You. Financial market executives sitting next to community leaders. International investors discovering that urban development can be more than real estate speculation. Michael then presented the first concrete results of the project. Approval rates in communities, improvements in quality of life, sustainable neighborhood appreciation without displacement of original residents. This is the future of urban development, Ralph concluded. The future where profit and purpose go hand in hand, where the market serves the city, not the other way around. The vote that followed was almost a formality, the investor group realizing that they had not only lost the legal battle, but also the public narrative withdrew their acquisition proposal. As the auditorium emptied, Anthony observed with satisfaction the 3 young men being congratulated by people from all sectors of society. His dream of uniting market power with the real needs of the city was finally becoming reality. You know, he said to Victor, who was observing the scene beside him, when I started driving a taxi after years as a consultant, many thought I had gone crazy. Victor smiled. And now they understand that you were just a few steps ahead, seeing the city as it really is, preparing the ground for this transformation. The true transformation, Anthony replied, is just beginning. 1 year had passed since the historic assembly at the World Trade Center. The old Phoenix Project mansion, now completely restored, had been transformed into a social innovation center where entrepreneurs and community leaders met to discuss the future of the city. On an autumn afternoon, Anthony parked his taxi in front of the mansion for the last time. "Are you sure about this?" asked Ralph, receiving his old friend at the entrance. "You still have much to teach all of us." Anthony smiled, observing the movement of people entering and leaving the mansion. Executives in suits animatedly conversing, with community leaders, architects presenting projects to groups of residents, young social entrepreneurs seeking mentorship. "My part is done," he replied, walking to the library he knew so well. Now it's time to pass the baton to the next generation. In the library, Michael and Lucas were already waiting for them, along with Albert and Victor. The meeting table was covered with newspapers and magazines, all highlighting the success of the first year of Horizon Project 2.0. "The final numbers have arrived," announced Lucas, projecting graphs on the wall. "The shared ownership model has not only proven viable, but is being replicated in 3 other major cities." Michael leafed through a social impact report. The approval rate in communities reached 97%. Most importantly, we achieved development without displacement. Families not only remained in their neighborhoods, but became protagonists of the transformation. "And the market finally understood our vision," added Ralph. "We have a waiting list of investors wanting to participate in the next phase, all willing to accept our shared governance terms." Victor, who was observing the scene with pride, spoke up. "You know, Anthony, when you started the Phoenix Project 20 years ago, I thought you were just another idealist trying to change the world." "And wasn't I?" Anthony provoked, a playful gleam in his eyes. "You were much more than that," Victor replied. "You understood something that took me decades to realize, that true power isn't in money or influence, but in the ability to unite people around a greater purpose." Albert approached the window, observing the sunset over New York City. "And to think it all began with a taxi ride." "It wasn't just a ride," Michael corrected, smiling at Anthony. "It was the moment we learned that there's always a better way, even when we think we're lost." Anthony walked to the wall where the old city map was still hanging, now updated with the project's impact points. Each mark represented a story of transformation, a renewed community, a changed life. "Do you know why I chose to be a taxi driver after so much time as a consultant?" he asked, touching specific points on the map. "Because I realized that to change a system, we first need to understand the people who live within it. Each ride was an opportunity to hear a story, to understand a dream, to identify a need." Ralph joined him by the map. "And now? What happens with the Phoenix project?" "Now," Anthony replied, taking the taxi keys from his pocket, "it belongs to you." The true mission of the project was always to create a new generation of leaders who understood that success and social impact are not opposing concepts. He handed the keys to Ralph. "My last passenger has already reached his destination. Now, it's time for you to lead others along the same path." Lucas frowned. "The taxi keys. They're not just keys," Anthony explained. "They're a reminder that sometimes we need to change our perspective to see the true potential for transformation that exists on every corner of this city." Victor approached, placing a hand on his nephew's shoulder. "So, Ralph, ready for your first ride as president of the group?" "Actually," Ralph replied, looking at Michael and Lucas, "I think we need to make a small change in the organizational structure." He walked to the meeting table and picked up 3 folders. "From today, the group will have a shared presidency. Just as communities are an integral part of the project, our leadership should also reflect the different knowledge and perspectives that brought us here." Michael and Lucas smiled, understanding the symbolism of the gesture. It wasn't just an administrative decision. It was the consolidation of everything they had learned throughout that journey. "And the taxi?" asked Albert, curious. "It will continue circulating," Ralph replied. "But now each executive of the group, regardless of position, will spend 1 day per month as a taxi driver, so we never forget where we came from and who we work for." Anthony observed his former apprentices with satisfaction. The sun had already set, but the city shone with a different light through the mansion's windows. It was the light of transformation, of purpose realized, of dreams beginning to become reality. "You know," he said, preparing to leave, "they say every taxi driver is a bit of a philosopher, that he knows the secrets of the city, the stories, behind the facades, the dreams hidden on every corner. But what I learned in 20 years behind the wheel is that true wisdom isn't in knowing the secrets, but in using that knowledge to make a difference." He walked to the door, stopping one last time to look at the group he had helped form. The Phoenix project was never about building buildings or doing business. It was about building bridges between people, about transforming dreams into reality, about proving that it's possible to do things differently. When Anthony finally left the mansion, he wasn't just a taxi driver retiring. He was a mentor seeing his legacy flourish, a dreamer seeing his ideals transform into reality, a teacher seeing his students exceed all expectations. And somewhere on the streets of New York City, a new taxi driver was beginning his journey, carrying with him not just passengers, but also the seeds of transformation that Anthony had planted over 2 decades. Because some stories don't end, they just transform into new beginnings. Dear listeners, we hope that Anthony's journey and his apprentices have touched your hearts and shown that true transformation begins with small gestures and big dreams. If this story about purpose, mentorship, and renewal resonated with you, don't forget to